Welcome, everyone, to Pursuing Justice. We have had a theme this month where we have spoken to Ken Hartman, and we've been talking about Life Without Parole. And now, today, we are speaking with Ken's daughter, Alia. Just a little background, although I do encourage my listeners to go back to part one of the first interview with Ken and the second. Ken was accused of a crime that he did commit, a little bit different than the people I usually talk to who are wrongfully convicted. And he was given a life without parole sentence, of which he served 38 years. And he was given his freedom by Governor Brown 3 years ago. And that's what we've been talking about, his life before, or should I say, during prison. And we will be talking to him about life after prison. So we've invited Alia Hartman to talk to us. And I'm delighted that you're here with us today. Alia, welcome to our program.
Thanks.
You're welcome. All right. So you had a very unique, what I would call unique childhood, different than the way many children grow up, because you were conceived in a family visit at prison. And your dad and I were talking a little bit about that. And so the visits initially were family visits. They were. Can you tell? Do you remember how those visits worked out? Were they in a trailer, or how did that work out when you came to see him with your mom?
I don't have any memories of the family visits.
You don't. You were too young. And how old were you when the family visits, which were almost like like a weekend visit? How old were you when those were taken away?
Well, I was born in 1995, and the law changed in 96.
Oh, wow. So hardly any time. No wonder you don't remember it. So the majority of your visits were in a visiting room. And how much of that do you remember?
Well, I mean, I spent my whole life seeing my dad in visiting room.
Right,
so.
Right. And how do you deal with that as a child? I was saying to your dad that I visit someone in a women's prison and I see toddlers come in all the time, and it breaks my heart. But what was that like for you?
I think as a kid, and my dad spent my entire life in prison, so I didn't really know anything else. So it didn't strike me as being odd or scary or different. It was just the only thing that I'd ever known.
Yeah. But was there an opportunity to play, or was there a separate section of the visiting room for children and their families?
Well, most of the people who visit men's prisons, which I don't know how it works for women's prisons,
right?
Because I've never been in one, but most of the people that were going in on those visiting days were families and were women, many of which had younger children. So it was a pretty common occurrence. I definitely wasn't the only kid in the visiting room, which is just it's like a big empty room with a podium at the front where a guard sits and kind of like looks over the room, and then there's just little tables, kind of like a cafeteria, scattered around, and like a wall of vending machines for food.
Right.
My mom lobbied on behalf of bringing in play areas into the visiting rooms when I was pretty young. I don't remember a time before there being a play area but I know that happened sometime during my early childhood.
I see. So would you label the prisons child-friendly or not?
I don't know. I've never really, I think when it's such an integral part of your life, you don't really have the luxury of like looking at it.
Mm-hmm. But as you look back now, would you have changed anything?
I mean, maybe I I don't think prisons are, as good as they could be. That's for sure. I mean, the prison system in America is a total nightmare. But,
right.
For me, like the visiting room for me was a place where I got to be with my family, and it was a place of community because the other people that I saw every week were there with their families.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like a feeling of going back home and getting to be around a lot of people who loved each other, and getting to, be with my parents together in the same room.
Right. Did you see the same families and children each time you went?
Pretty consistently. My dad was at the same prison for the vast majority of the time that I was alive. He was incarcerated in Lancaster, and for most of that time he was on a yard. So for most of my life, I was seeing the same people in the same visiting room every week.
And how so often families live very, very far away because prisoners are moved. I think there's a limit on how far they can be moved, maybe 500 miles. But what was the proximity in terms of when you were visiting him? How far away were you?
For the first 10 years of my life, he was really only 25 minutes away from where we were living. So I was really lucky in that regard.
Yes, you certainly were. Yeah. Now, kids in school, wherever you were in school, did they know that you had a parent in prison, and were they understanding about that situation?
It wasn't something that I ever hid. I've always had a really close relationship with my dad. I think he's a good person, and I think he's had an interesting life, so I like talking about him. I don't know. I mean, I think I got picked on for having a dad in prison just as much as any kid gets picked on for being different. Mm-hmm. And I think being around other kids who were in the same shoes as me in the visiting room, I think a lot of, at least in my experience, it seems like a lot of the shame of having a parent in prison was something that, like, the family was more like secretive about it, and then that put shame on the kid.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a secret in my family, and my mom never presented it as something that I should be ashamed of, and my dad was always pretty open about it. So I don't think that I ever internalized too many negative feelings about it.
That's great, because that does not always happen. Were there teachers that were pretty understanding also about your situation?
I always felt like the adults were harder to deal with than the other kids growing up.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, I don't think, children don't really have too many like preconceived notions about like different types of people and what that could mean. And, you know, kids kind of just will accept whatever is in front of them. Whereas I think when adults would learn that I had a dad who was in prison, they, you know, built up a stereotype of what that must mean and what kind of person that must make me.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah.
you know, I think it was a lot harder to deal with adults.
That's very, very interesting observation. Now, big question here. How did you find out after so many, many years, I guess actually 22 years, that your dad, who was serving a life without parole sentence, which is exactly what it means, how did you find out that your dad was going to be released? How did you know about that?
Well, it wasn't the first time that he had applied for a commutation. He applied for one when Arnold Schwarzenegger was still governor of California, but that one was denied. So the second time that he applied for a commutation, he had kind of kept it hidden from me and from my mom. He didn't want us to get our hopes up.
Sure.
And I didn't find out about it until it had already been approved. I got like a call from like a family friend that was kind of saying like, oh, like, have you heard like the good news?
And how much?
Which was nice.
How much in advance did you hear the good news?
Well, I didn't hear about it until his commutation had been approved.
And when was that in terms of his actual release?
Oh gosh. Maybe like 2 or 3 months.
Okay.
I don't really know the exact date, but he got released fairly soon after.
Yeah, certainly.
The commutation, I think it was around Easter was when the commutation went through, and by like Christmas time, he had already got parole.
Right. So was that a difficult transition for you? I want you to speak just for yourself. After your dad came out of prison, where you had kind of gotten used to the idea that he never would, and now big change.
Yeah, it was difficult. I mean, I had never prepared for the idea that my dad would get out of prison. I had kind of just accepted that was how it had always been and that it would always be that way.
Right.
And so much of my relationship with my dad was defined by that sense of absence in the everyday. I had kind of, you know, it was almost like he didn't really exist in the real world for me. Right. It was, you know, I was seeing him in the same room. He was always wearing the same clothes.
Right.
And our relationship was really like kept separate from everything else. So when he got out of prison, it was difficult for me to adjust to being around him and to seeing him in different contexts. And I think being able to be around him in a way that I'd never been around him before really served